Welcome to all of you who are attending today's Northwest Authors Program. The Northwest Authors Speaker Series showcases writers and authors of the Pacific Northwest. I'm Wanda. It's Saturday, January 20th, and we're at the Cannon Beach Library with award-winning author Deb Vanasse. Vanasse. Okay.
Good job.
Vanasse. Deb grew up in the Midwest, got her master's degree in California, and then worked in Alaska, teaching high school and college for many years, much of it in remote areas. During the 36 years she lived in Alaska, she co-founded 49 Writers, a statewide writing center where she taught creative writing workshops. In 2015, Deb and her husband pulled up their stakes and moved south to the Oregon coast. They now make their home off Sunset Beach Road between Astoria and Seaside. So she's a neighbor of ours. Wow. Yes. Deb, who also writes under the pen name Vanessa Lind, was first published in 1997. She has written over 25 books in genres that include narrative nonfiction, historical fiction, literary fiction, nature, and young adult children's books. Focusing on hidden histories and stories about strong women from the past, she likes to keep readers turning pages with characters who aren't easily forgotten. One such hidden history and strong, unforgettable woman from the past is Kate Carmack. In 2016, Deb published Wealth Woman, a biography of Kate Carmack, the Tagish Native American wife of Klondike Gold Rush prospector George Carmack. Deb spent 3 years combing through historical records, oral histories, and family memories before bringing Kate's life story into the light of written history. Deb's 2022 nonfiction narrative, Roar of the Sea, a story of treachery and obsession with Alaska's most valuable wildlife, the fur seal, also brought to light a mostly hidden history, one of pirates, competing nations, and near war. It was a 2023 Oregon State Book Award finalist. We will hear much more about this book and others in just a few minutes when Deb gives her presentation. A reminder, we invite all your questions, but please keep them until after the presentation. Now, without further ado, I present Deb Vanasse.
All right, I'll probably do a combination of sitting and standing. If you have any trouble hearing, just do something like this, and I'll ramp it up. I spend a lot of time just like at my keyboard, so sometimes my voice isn't like projecting like it used to when I was a teacher. So as you can see today, I thought it would be fun to talk about the story and history because that represents a lot of my more recent career. And I'll talk about how I kind of pivoted into historical narratives, nonfiction, and also historical fiction. I will read, just to kind of prep you, like 2 pages from 3 of the books, just so you can kind of get a flavor of what I'm talking about. So I'm not just talking abstractly. So if we're going to look at the story and history, okay, let's see here. We should do a... Oh, there we go. Sorry. I was going the wrong way.
It's counterintuitive.
Apparently, I don't understand arrows. Okay. So for me, my interest in history started with an interest in place, and that may seem a little counterintuitive. But as you heard, I grew up in the Midwest, which has its own charm, but frankly, it also has little charm in a lot of ways compared to like the place where we are so fortunate to live. In that place, I grew up in kind of a unique setting. My father worked at a state mental institution. It was huge, and we lived on the grounds, which meant that growing up, a lot of I went to school in the community, but my friends in the community, their parents didn't really want them to come to my house to play. It was very, like foreign to them, and these people are scary. And so it was a unique setting. And I think that kind of instilled in me a feeling of how important place is in your life. It wasn't, I don't want to give the wrong impression. It wasn't by any means a horrible place to grow up, but it was unusual. And as I started, we moved around the Midwest a lot. And as I got into sort of the North Woods area where I did my undergraduate work in Minnesota, I realized, there's some really beautiful places out there and I wanted to see them. So I ended up graduating college in Alaska, where I spent 36 years. And Alaska, of course, I'm sure many of you have been there on cruises, some people fishing, but that there is a powerful draw in terms of the place there. Like the landscape is just so much a part of everything. And so, not surprising that my first books, I didn't put a lot of my books started publishing. As was said, in 1997, with a young adult novel set in one of the Yupik Eskimo villages, based on one of the Yupik Eskimo villages where I taught. And from there, I did some young adult novels. I did some children's picture books. I did literary fiction. Cold Spell was kind of my foray into grown-up books. I don't like to say adult books because that sounds like maybe it's a little, past PG, which this is not. So that was the sort of foundational for me, exploring place in a lot of different genres. And while I was in Alaska, when I met my husband, he had already hiked the Chilkoot Trail. Oh, and there he is. Yeah, look at that. He had already hiked to the Chilkoot Trail a couple of times. And so we did that together. Two things you should know about me and that trip. Well, actually, there's three. One is that I had never been backpacking before, and I haven't been since. I'm not sure what that is. It is a very difficult trail, and it's very high. It was called the Chilkoot Trail. The prospectors called it the meanest 33 miles in history. It is a difficult hike. So number two is I'm afraid of heights, and it does go straight up and then down. The down is a little better than the up, but there's some heights. So it looks like I'm smiling in that picture, but I'm actually gritting my teeth because it's all dropping off. And then the third thing, which is too long a story to get into here, but we always say we hiked the Chilkoot Trail in our underwear, which is a true statement because we had to strip because they're down to get through a flooded area that was pretty treacherous, and they closed the trail right behind us. But here we are. We made it. So how does that connect to anything? Kate Carmack, I knew from that hike. Well, first of all, it's a hike through history. The miners, when they were going up to the Klondike, had to bring 1,000 pounds of supplies because the first year there was a famine. But remember, they're hiking up like this. So they're throwing stuff off once they get past Canadian Customs. They're throwing stuff off right and left. And so you're walking past like stoves and boats and things that were just cast aside because they couldn't carry them any farther. Mostly the people who had the resources hired native packers. And Kate, whose name was a born name was Shatla, was one of those packers. And having such a difficult time myself and knowing that she was carrying loads of like 65 pounds over and over again made me very interested in her story. The other thing that made me interested in her story was that I knew that in most of the historical accounts, she had been poorly presented and, as I discovered, misrepresented. And so it's a little fraught, of course, as a person outside of the culture to write someone's story from another culture. So I did enter that space with care, but the more I looked into it, the more I felt this is a story that needs to be told, because again and again, when I looked at books and researched her, it was all about, you know, what a horrible person she was. And that's not who she was at all. She was portrayed that way because her husband dumped her and didn't want to give her any of their fortune. And so he, of course, had to kind of make her look bad. That's how it happened. And that whole story is told here. So there was a lot of drama in it. And it was a fascinating project to work on. However, I did learn some things in my first foray into narrative nonfiction. And one is that it's a lot easier if you work with a subject who is literate and could write down her story herself. But that was part of the reason why I felt like her story needed to be told, because she couldn't read and write. She could speak 3 languages, but she couldn't read and write. And so she would, beyond, you know, like her name. And so, so I had to use a lot of different sources, anthropological, living history through her descendants, and court records, of which there were many because of her getting shut out of their fortune. So that's all came together. And the more I researched, the more compelling the story was. And the more I started to be drawn from what started as place and then into history, which I think really do intersect. I think there's another dimension for me as a writer that's sort of transcendent. And that's where I see those things intersecting. And so for me, you know, and I think a lot of us maybe have this experience, if we think about history at all, is just like when I'm in a place, I sort of feel the presence of people who were there before. You know, not in a spooky way, but just that there is a transcendence. There's kind of a dimensionality there that I find really interesting. But I do love fiction. I love story. So it's the story and history that really interested me. I don't know if you all had like I can remember still my high school history teacher, Mr. Colson. He was one of those social studies teachers who was there because he was a football coach and he had to teach something. So I don't think he liked history. He didn't seem to, you know, it was all just dry memorizing facts and dates and stuff. And so I really wasn't that interested in history till I got my degree in the humanities. And then I started to see, oh, there's stories here, and I love stories. So when I set out to tell Kate's story, I really wanted to tell it as a story, but I wanted it to be authentic. And I didn't have her writings to work from. So there's a lot of sort of tricks, I guess you could call them from a writer's perspective, or techniques is probably a better way to say that we can use when we want to take nonfiction and tell it in a compelling way. And I think maybe one of the best ways to do that is to talk about that is to just read a little bit from the beginning of the book, so you can kind of see how I set a scene in a place where I wasn't there, but I had to draw from a lot of sources. When I'm researching a book, and this also applies to my historical fiction, when I'm setting a scene, if there's anything I can find out about that scene that will make it more authentic, I'm all in with that. Sometimes you can find the weather on a certain day in a certain place. Sometimes you can find, you know, somebody else who was there at a particular place and wrote about it, where your character is. And so those things, I really like to pull my readers into the scene. And you have to be able to, you know, all stories have scenes. When you think about when you tell a story to your friends about something compelling that happened to you, often you're setting a scene. Well, it was like this, and he said this, and she said that. And so you know, then that brings in the element of dialogue. How do you handle dialogue? I personally, writing nonfiction, don't invent dialogue. Some people do. I only use dialogue that can be drawn from a source, like maybe something she said in court, or, you know, something that someone said about her in a letter, that sort of thing. So those are some of the challenges we have. But and of course, you want to bring in character. You want to develop the character. That's really tricky too, I think, as a writer of narrative nonfiction. We'll see it again in Roar of the Sea. I seem to be, I'm not sure what this says about me, but I seem to be drawn to outliers in history. I like hidden histories. I like the outliers. They're much harder to write about though, because they tend to be characters that, as I described with Kate, that was, you know, she was misrepresented. And so I'm digging to find what's the truth about her, but I don't want to go overkill the other way and, you know, venerate her either. So getting that balance is important. And then you're always looking for conflict. Conflict's such a big part of stories. And so when I'm looking like, is this going to be a worthy project? Well, this story had a lot of built-in conflict, as I explained. So, and not just the dispute over the money and the marriage, but also just the broader cultural context, right? Because the Klondike changed everything for her. Her particular tribal group, we would call it. They wouldn't have called it that. The Tagish were very isolated and compared to the native groups surrounding them, and their way of life just, you know, overnight literally changed. So so that's conflict that's helpful when you're writing narrative nonfiction and of course fiction. So I'll just read a couple pages from this to give you a flavor. This is the first chapter is called Gold I Bring. And it's, I should say, it's kind of based on this photo. I know it's hard to see, but this is a photo of Kate is right here, and she's surrounded by her brothers, her husband, and her little girl, Graffy Grace. And they are on the deck of a ship called the Roanoke. This was her first foray out of where she had grown up in the Yukon. We think of it as Alaska, but it was the Yukon, where the Klondike happened. Okay. The Roanoke is loaded with gold. Bags, cans, boxes, and crates cram its lower deck, jammed with a whopping 10 tons of the precious metal panned and sluiced by lucky devils in the northern wilderness. Only a year ago, few had heard of the patch of low mountains and dense northern spruce now known as the Klondike. But these days, like an incantation of magic, the very word Klondike invokes abundance, the vindication of the American dream, and the triumph of the individual in its most measurable manifestation, wealth. 9 days after setting out from the dreary and once sleepy port of St. Michael, near the wide, muddy mouth of the Yukon River, the Roanoke chugs toward the dock of the North American Transport Company in Seattle, a city that enjoys a symbiotic relationship with the Klondike and its magic, the city having built the magic, and the magic having built the city. 458 passengers crowd the ship's decks, eager for land. Sunshine seeps past clouds to light the throng gathered to welcome them in their gold. Women in cinch waist dresses and high narrow hats, men in suits and suspenders, bowlers and derbies and straw tops. Everyone wants to see who has gotten rich in the Klondike and who has returned empty-handed. In the Gilded Age of Horatio Alger and unbridled capitalism, Americans are exhorted to industry, thrift, and temperance. No one can quite reconcile the idea of gold so easy and plentiful that you need none of these virtues to claim it. The idea is as unsettling as it is enticing. And on this day in 1898, there is no small amount of envy as the Roanoke steams for shore, especially when it comes to the scruffy common folk on her decks, the nouveau made riche by gold. A particular challenge to American precepts on money, virtue, and class is the lone Indian woman on board the Roanoke, first called Chatois, now called Kate Carmack. On her wrists and fingers, she wears gold, thin bands that belie her new and extraordinary wealth. With a firm, dark-eyed gaze, she meets life head-on, grounded in the knowledge of who she is and where she has come from. Her features are soft, graceful, her resolve unwavering. Possessed of a ready smile, she is resilient, resourceful, and strong, headstrong even, with a temper. Determined and accomplished, she has already adapted in remarkable ways to circumstances beyond any she could ever have imagined, but the challenges ahead will prove even more formidable. So that just gives you a little, I guess, idea of my writing style and how that all works together. Hopefully, put that someplace where somebody doesn't need to buy it. So just before I go on to talk about Roar of the Sea, I will mention that in addition to just the personal satisfaction of it was a lot of work, it was a lot of research, it took longer than a lot of my other, certainly than writing fiction does for me, but it was very rewarding to, the book, True West Magazine chose it as one of their books of the year, and then even more important than that, the Canadian Mining Hall of Fame, which I get is a big deal in Canada because they have a lot of minerals. Their president contacted me and said, I read your book and we're going to put Kay Carmack in the Mining Hall of Fame. And it was a huge thing. And her relatives, her descendants were so thrilled by that. And they were also glad to have her story told, even if it wasn't by somebody from their culture. So that was fortunate for me. They were very helpful in providing, information that had been passed down. And one of her descendants even came last spring flew down to Portland, and we did a talk together at one of the conventions there because they do a lot of history lectures. So it's been very rewarding in that sense. So with that, so I had fun with it, took a long time. You can see how it was born out of my experience and with the intersection of place and history. Roar of the Sea was similar, same but different, as my husband and I like to say to each other. I was able to go to the Pribilof Islands, which I think people know mostly from The Deadliest Catch, but some fishermen here, fisher folks, gill netters, also fish up there in the Pribilofs. But it's very remote in terms of, like right here. So it's not a place you usually go when you visit Alaska, or even if you live there like I did and had traveled quite a bit around the state. But I was able to go out there because I've been writing, and schools would bring me in to talk about writing and work with students and teachers. And that was the call that came to me there. Someone who'd known my books, from in another context, asked me to come and work with the kids in the school. And you can see me there a little bit younger, because it was many years ago. I can't quite, I think it was about 10 years ago. The weather's horrible, and it's a beautiful place. It's so striking. It's one of my favorite places in Alaska, the Pribilof Islands. Two very, very tiny islands. And as I said, very remote, hard to get to, and the weather's horrible. So you get fogged in a lot, which I did when I got there. Couldn't get out for a few days, but they put me up in a little, most of Alaska's native villages have like quarters for itinerant people who come through, because there's so many, whether it's the boiler repair guy or, whoever, they'll have some place for them to stay. And I was staying in these quarters above the radio station, and they had a couple boxes of books. And he said, here's something to read while you're stuck. And it was a little self-published book by the Native Corporation called Slaves of the Harvest. And it was about the native people of the Pribilofs, who we would call Aleut. They call themselves Unanga. But it was a history of how they got there, because the islands were originally uninhabited, and they were brought by the Russians to harvest fur seals, of which there were like 5 million on these little tiny islands. I mean, it was just covered with seals. And so that was how they ended up at the Pribilofs, and they considered themselves slaves to the harvesting of seals, because even after Russia sold Alaska to the US, there was so much money in those fur seals that the US paid for the purchase of the entire state of Alaska with tax revenues from those seals within 10 years of the purchase. So there was a lot of money to be had, and they needed the native people who the Russians had brought to make that money continue to happen. And so the people were allowed very little freedom, to leave the island in terms of their wages, in terms of their living conditions. So that was my introduction. And I did learn through that book that there was one outsider who had come to the islands right after the US acquired them, acquired the whole state. And he had become an advocate for the people and especially for the seals. And his name was Henry Elliott, and he was an artist. And it interested, that just in itself interested me, like an artist becoming an activist for seals. Like, how does that all compute together? And the other piece that I found out in terms of conflict was that the United States almost went to war on multiple occasions because of these seals. And there were seal pirates. Once I got to the pirates, I was totally hooked. Okay, so how can you skip pirates, right? So that's how the project, and it gestated for quite a while. I actually started writing it when we first moved down here, and we're waiting for our house to be finished, the builders to finish with our house, and we were staying at a little cottage in Gearhart, and I thought this is going to be my next project. And it took me, again, a few years because the research was still difficult because I did not learn my lesson. I thought I had, because Henry Elliott was literate. He's a white male, so he had advantages in that respect. But he did not write his memoirs. He wrote about seals because he was so passionate about saving them. And so it turned out to be just another fascinating story. I like the subtitle to this, Treachery, Obsession, and Alaska's Most Valuable Wildlife. Arguably at the time, they might have been the world's most valuable wildlife. So so this was the Oregon State Book Award finalist last year, and I was really thrilled with that because to me, it was focused in place in Alaska, but it is a story that has broad-reaching implications because based on what happens in this book, we got our first international wildlife treaty that the world had ever known. And that, of course, now we're kind of used to, we have things like the Marine Mammal Act and the Migratory Birds Act. And, but what do you do with wildlife that doesn't belong to a nation, but the nations really want it to belong to them? And that's what these wars or near wars were about with the Russians, with the Japanese, with the British. Everybody wanted a piece of this very, very lucrative pie, if you want to put it that way, that consisted of the bluff fur seals. So I thought, again, I'm just going to read you like similarly, that's a hard word to say, short excerpts, just so you can hear again how I'm taking these pieces and trying to put together something that's going to read like a novel, but still tell what actually happened. And so this book actually starts with the first chapter is from a seal's point of view. That was super fun to write. And then the second one is from the main seal pirate's point of view. So the antagonist for my protagonist was a seal pirate. And he was a fascinating character as well. And so I wrote the second chapter from his point of view as he's being chased through the Bering Sea because there's a bounty on his head, basically. So then I need to get to my protagonist, the artist that saved the seals. And I, was kind of playing around with different ways to introduce him. And I decided to introduce him through, and again, I didn't have a wealth of his actual writings to work from as far as, if I was writing something that I would consider like drier nonfiction, I could have just gone to his writings about the seals. But I wanted to engage the reader as much as possible. And I came across a letter that he'd written back home. He married a woman from the Pribilofs, brought her to Ohio where he was from. They had 10 children. And then he spent the rest of his life and ran everything they had into the ground trying to save the seals, which meant that he had to go to Washington a lot. Every winter he would go to Washington or every congressional session and try to get Congress to care about these seals and to stop them because they almost, I told you 5 million, they almost went extinct. And even Teddy Roosevelt said, maybe we should just kill them all. Like that was how bad it was. And he's a conservationist. So anyway, Henry Elliott's making these trips. He writes this letter home. He brought his 6-year-old son with him. He had a lot of kids, but he the 6-year-old son got to go on this trip to Washington, and the dad wrote home to say, here's how the journey went for us. And I thought, okay, I'm going to introduce the dad through the son's eyes. I think that would be really interesting. So that's what you're going to hear. This is when you as a reader first meet Henry Elliott. And the chapter is called Portrait of the Artist as a Megatherium. And that refers to, because it does go, I paint this little scene with the son going to Washington, and then it drops back into the rest of the chapter is about the dad. And he was, there was a group of fun-loving young naturalists at the Smithsonian during the Civil War, and they called themselves the Megatherium. The Megatherium being the extinct giant sloth. I learned, I didn't know that before I did my research, but anyway, that's why it's called that. And I'll just read these first few paragraphs. For 6-year-old Frank Elliott III, a train trip with his father was a grand adventure. Traveling from Cleveland to Pittsburgh in 1886, they rode in the train's parlor car. In Pittsburgh, Frank swung a lunch basket at his side as he trotted beside his father, crossing the station to board the train that would carry them to Washington overnight. In the sleeping car, he watched in fascination as a porter made up the beds. After climbing into the lower berth, he promptly fell asleep to the clacking of the wheels. Even more exciting than all of this was going with his father to the Smithsonian Institution when they reached Washington. His father spoke of the place often, but for Frank to see its wonders with his own eyes brought pure amazement. The Smithsonian really did have a castle, just as his father had said. When his father showed Frank the tiny room where he had slept when he was younger, Frank declared his desire to sleep in that very same place all by himself, the way his father had. But his father said no, it was only for the Megatheria, whatever that meant, who got to sleep there, and they were no more. Instead, Frank and his father returned to the big brick house where they had rented a room to sleep. They had to be well rested, his father said, because Sunday was going to bring about more tromping around the city as they called on people his father knew, important people. Professor Baird from the Smithsonian, Mrs. Hutchison from the ACC, and some senators too. So Frank would have to be on his best behavior. When they got to the big brick house, Frank had to admit it felt good to stretch his tired legs on the bed. Before drifting off to sleep, he asked his father again how long 3 weeks were. Grand adventure or not, he missed his mother and maybe even his 5 sisters. He knew they must be jealous of him getting to go on their father's winter campaign. One time before Frank was born, 2 of his sisters, Grace and Flora, had traveled with their mother and father to Alaska, which Frank supposed was even farther from Ohio than Washington, D.C. There they had visited their mother's family and seen the seals their father was forever talking about. But that was years ago, and he doubted his sisters had seen anything half as exciting as he had today. For one thing, he was pretty sure there was no Smithsonian in Alaska. The Smithsonian did have in its collection some of Alaska's people, maybe even some of Frank's own ancestors on his mother's side. Not living people, but even better, Alaskan mummies. Wrapped in furs and grass blankets, they had been found in a cave warmed by active fumaroles, which Frank's father said were steamy openings in the earth that might one day explode into volcanoes. Frank could have looked at mummies all day, especially knowing it was his own father who had arranged for them to be brought to Washington. Frank found volcanoes and mummies a lot more exciting than the important people he would meet. Equally exciting were the pirates his father spoke of in grave tones. These pirates were not searching for buried treasure the way Long John Silver had. They were after seals, which his father said were a sort of treasure too, because people paid lots of money for sealskin coats. And his father should know, because no matter where they went in Washington, the talk always came around to seals, seals, seals. So at any rate, that's how I introduced the protagonist of the book, and much drama ensues from there. That is Henry Elliott in the slide, and the Seal Pirates scene. That I don't know if that's one that he did. Part of his lobbying to Congress was through art. He did a lot of art, a lot of sketches he'd done when he was at the Pribilofs, and then colored to make them more compelling. He'd leave them with different congressmen, they were all men then, to hang in their offices so they could talk to other people about the plight of the Pribilof seals. So after that book, well, after it went under contract, once a book goes under contract, then you start, working on the next one. I did a pivot back to fiction because I thought, I've gone from place to history, and I love history, and I love plays still, but I really love fiction. So what about historical fiction? And I decided to use a pen name and do some historical series that focus on strong women. And so I chose Vanessa Lind as my pen name because with my last name being Vanasse, I get called Vanessa all the time. So I thought it'd be easy for me to remember, never forget my pen name. So then it was just a matter of like, okay, where's the story? What do I want to write about? And this actually, my foray into historical fiction started with a newspaper art. I get ideas in the weirdest places. A newspaper article about a girl on a bicycle. And the girl on the bicycle was, that was part of the article, but and I think there might have even been a picture of her, this young girl on a bicycle during World War II. But she was a spy. She was a young teenager who was a spy in France, and she had just died recently, like this would have been 3 years ago. So I was like, oh, wow, I didn't really know all that. Like I didn't know women spies and stuff. And so anyway, I did some research, and a lot has been written about World War II and spies, and even women spies. I don't know if I should say a lot, but there's some great. Kristen Hanna has written about the Nightingale women spies. Kate Flynn, who I really like, has written some books about women spies in World War II. So that interests me, and I'll probably get around to that, joining that little group at some point. But I thought, well, what about America? What about like women spies in the U.S.? Because I know that place, right? And it's a little harder for me to write outside what places that I haven't been to or lived. So sure enough, yeah, women spies in the Civil War were a thing. And I found the story of one in particular, a female spy who'd been with the Pinkertons. Her name was Hattie Lawton. And she's documented in history, but conveniently for the fiction writer, she drops off the map shortly after a really dramatic event in her life, which I can't tell you about because it spoils the book, the ending of the book. But that event is partially pictured here. This is a magazine artist rendition of part of her life. But she did, nobody really knows what happened to her. Of course, she was a spy. So a lot of the spies, interesting thing about it, lots of interesting things I learned about women spies in general and women spies in the Civil War in particular. First of all, it's a great, I shouldn't say nobody likes war. I don't like war personally. However, for women, when there's a war, in times in history when women were kept down, war sort of loosens those bonds in different ways. Like, we think of Rosie the Riveter in World War II, but it was also in spying because men didn't suspect that women would know anything. They would, or understand anything. So they would just, you could be in a room with a couple of enemy officers, and they'd be talking about their strategy, and you'd just be going about your business. And then you could go tell your, whoever you reported to. And they were none the wiser. They also wore big skirts, and they would smuggle things in their skirts, those big hoop skirts. They would smuggle things. They would smuggle messages. So anyway, I ended up with a 4-book series that I call the Secrets of the Blue and Gray. under that pen name. And I thought I'd read you just, again, a snippet from the first book. So going back into just strictly fiction or historical fiction, it did feel freeing in a lot of ways, because I can make the, and you're going to hear this when you hear me read, because now I'm free to create characters in whatever way I want. I can make my scene. I can put them in the scene. They can talk to each other. You know, I can build in antagonists for them that maybe didn't exist. My work tends to be pretty rich in historical detail, but I'm going to say, and I just went through some reader comments on my book that Vanessa's book that comes out on Thursday. I went through some early reader comments to do my newsletter. And again, readers say, I just love the historical detail, but I don't belabor it. So I'm looking again for those little facts that bring it to life. And so I'll read this part, and then I'll talk about like what I pulled from to set the scene with these two characters. So it's going to be, I named my main character who runs through the 4 books, Hattie Lawton is her last name. Or sorry, that's the real one. Logan. Yeah. I have to keep, I have a software program where I have to keep all my characters straight, because I have 2 series now, and you're trying to keep all these, minor characters, and yeah, it's a lot to keep track of. So far so good, knock on wood. All right, so this book, these books are just like, the chapters are just chapter 1, 2, 3. I didn't get creative about them, but in this particular book, I put the exact dates, like I really fine-tuned the timeline for it. So this chapter 1 starts on September 2nd, 1862. Not yet 9 in the morning, and the September day already promised sweltering heat. South of the nation's capital, storm clouds piled along the horizon, teasing the promise of rain that never came. Directly overhead, the Washington sky was brilliant and cloudless, the air still and humid. Hattie Logan felt perspiration beating around her collar. Like a July day back in Indiana, Hattie thought, and then immediately banished the idea, wanting nothing more to do with where she'd come from. Forward, that was the only direction for her. She and Anne approached the Treasury building, a massive stone structure that towered over the path, casting a welcome shadow. It's been 3 days, Anne said. We should check the casualty lists. 2 days, Hattie corrected. And if we stop, we'll be late, and Lucy will run straight to Miss Warren. Lucy Hamilton was the self-appointed supervisor of Alan Pinkerton's mailroom girls, who opened letters the courier brought, searching for rebel secrets that would aid the Union cause. Miss Warren won't mind, Anne insisted. Of course Anne would say that. She was on good terms with the woman who oversaw their work for Mr. Pinkerton. Maybe she won't mind about you, Hattie said, but she doesn't like me. That's not true. It's just that you clam up whenever she's around. I'm only being discreet, Hattie said. It was a nice way of saying that the less she said, the less she'd be asked about who she was and where she came from. So I'll just stop there and talk a little bit about like what's, from my point of view as a writer, like what's in that scene. So I hope that you like sense some conflict between Hattie and her supervisor, and Anne has a different relationship. There's a mention of casualty lists. There should be questions like, why are they looking at casualty lists? Who are they looking for? And what's the Pinkerton mailroom? And this Lucy person who's the self-appointed, appointed herself to be in charge of it. So where does it all come from? Like just those few paragraphs. I told you about the weather, like I did in this particular case, like I couldn't find a weather report for that day in Washington, D.C. But because there were battles going on, I could find accounts of like what was happening to the South, and had they come through, those troops had been through rain a couple of days before. So I can put those clouds on the horizon, right? That you can see. And I know what the weather's like in Washington, D.C. at that time of year. So I can make it hot and give the perspiration, and I can set up the conflict as well, which is a major conflict in the story of Hattie not wanting to think about where she came from and being quote unquote discreet, meaning she's not telling people, well, what's she hiding, right? Mm-hmm. So she's working in secrets because there's a mailroom where they're opening mail. So that's another piece of history. So the Pinkerton did help the Union during the Civil War. He was employed, worked closely with General McClellan until he was dismissed. And he did have his spies opening mail, looking for secrets that were being passed back and forth. Because I never thought about this, but during the Civil War, you had to have mail service, right? Like the country was divided, but maybe your brother and sister lived in the South and you lived in the North. So how do you communicate with them? Well, you write letters. Well, who sends those letters? I mean, the postal services aren't going to like deliver to each other. So they had couriers. And the couriers were often spies, if they could get away with it. So there ends up being a love interest, and that's why it's called the courier's wife, because Hattie ends up playing, as part of her role as spy, she sort of graduates from the mailroom into actually boots on the ground spying, where she poses as the courier's wife, which is actually what happened with Hattie Lawton in real time. And they get caught. So then what happens, right? So did Pinkerton have a mailroom where these women did the spying? No, he did not. Like, that's fictionalized because I needed a setting. And I always do an author's note at the end of my historical fiction and, explain, like, I mean, I can't go into every single detail, but in general, like, these are things I made up and these are things that are true. So that was a really fun series to write. And I used sort of the war events in the war and other spies as anchors. And my husband probably got sick of me saying, like, did you know that they, like, the Confederates tried to take over Lake Erie? Like, they almost took over Lake Erie. I didn't know that. And so I have my Gray Waters book is like, a lot of it's centered on that. And Pinkerton, by the way, did have female spies. That's one of the things he's known for. And I put one of the real characters in this book is Kate Warren. Now, obviously, when she interacts with my characters, that didn't really happen because my characters didn't really live, but she did. And she was an interesting woman as well. She actually helped foil an assassination plot. There was a plot to assassinate Lincoln on the way to his first inauguration. And she was instrumental in discovering that plot and foiling it. So then I finished that series and I thought, what next? And I decided to do dual timeline historical mysteries, which is kind of challenging because you're writing 2 books in one, really. And I decided to set them around here because I love this place. Back to place again. So here come history and place one more time. And so, what to write. I mean, this, so many ideas. But I was intrigued by, I don't even really know how I came across this book, Sensational, but it's about the girl stunt reporters. They were also called petticoat detectives. So right away, my radar goes up because, like, detective spies, this is in my ballpark. And of course, the most famous one that you see pictured here, Nellie Bly, right? Most people know her name, but there were a whole slew of, and I'm always looking because, again, I'm looking for what did women do in history that people don't generally know about. So you have the spies in the wars, but you also have these girl reporters who, this was something that they were allowed to do. And they went in and did incredible investigations. Like one of the sort of the stories that Tim Todd in her nonfiction book sort of hangs everything on is that is this girl reporter, as they called them, did a series of articles on abortion in Chicago in the 1890s. No bylines, nobody knows who she was, but she would go to these doctors and discreetly say in all the Victorian way that, she was in need of some services. And then she wrote about the fact that these doctors were willing to take her money and potentially kill her, you know. And so it was a big expose, really. So fascinating. So I thought, well, let's have one of those girl reporters in Astoria during the Gilded Age, which I love the Gilded Age, the Victorian era. I think it's just so fascinating. And so let's put her in Astoria, and then let's put a modern day bookshop owner in Astoria, and their stories are going to always like intertwine, and so something's going to bring them together. And let's see, yeah. So I won't read from this one, but I mean, it's much the same in terms of the crafting as I did with the Civil War series, except that I'm weaving the two stories together. So I write the past story first, because that really anchors everything. And then I write the present day story, knowing that they've got to come together. Like my present day people have to also be connected, and it has to really matter, because that's important in fiction and nonfiction. I think the stakes have to be high, right? So it has to matter for the people in the present. They can't just be like, oh, I'm curious about this. It has to actually matter that they discover what happened in the past. And so they've been really fun to write. And this is the first three are out already. The fourth one comes out this Thursday, and then I'm writing the fifth one, and that'll wrap up that series. So yeah, so that's basically when we talk about the story and history. Now you know perhaps more than you wanted to about what the story and history means to me as an author. And if you want to keep up with what I'm doing, the best way to do it is to sign up for my newsletter at vanassalyn.com. That's really where I mean, I'm not saying I'll never write anything as Deb Vanasse anymore, but I'm having so much fun with this. And one of the reasons I'm having so much fun is these books are all I publish myself. I've published traditionally for years, but by publishing myself, I get to choose my covers. I get to interact with readers. I get to give discounts. I get to do so much. So it's just been really, really fun. So with that in mind, does anyone have any questions? Because I can talk a little more, but I want to stop and see if you, yes.
I was curious about something back when they were lined up on the ship.
Mm-hmm.
And it looked like it was a date from 1991.
So that was, yeah, good question. Very observant. That was an archive. The archivist put that on there.
Okay.
Yeah, and that's you know, if it had come from, let's say, the Smithsonian, you probably wouldn't find that. But this was from like a little tiny archives in Dawson City, Yukon. So, and it may have come to them in that way, or maybe somebody just wrote it on there. I mean, it's interesting what happens sometimes. I think it was for Roar of the Sea. I was working with an archives at a natural history museum in Ohio, and a volunteer had just like walked off with a bunch of his papers, you know, like not maliciously, they just can't find them. So sometimes it's great pursuing these hidden histories, but sometimes it's harder. Yeah, so very observant. Anything else anybody's wondering? Yes.
Well, how do you connect or intertwine the two stories at two different times
in this series that's
yes,
set in Astoria, yeah, which is called the Tidewater Chronicles, by the way. I didn't even mention that. So when the series are really, for every writer does these differently. I'm mostly character driven, so, but not completely. So I'm thinking about like this, I'll use the book I'm working on now as an example, because I'm kind of just into that stage. So when I got to the fifth book in the series, I didn't even know the title. Like I knew this is going to be the last book in this series. It's ready to wrap up. I knew I had threads I had to wrap up, both in the present and the past. So I had to do a lot of brainstorming, which I always do by hand because I get better ideas that way. And I decided that book was going to be The Smuggler's Secret. Okay, so then I do figure out my past story and what that's going to involve, which, not to say too much because things can change, but but I've written enough to know that it's going to involve the smuggling of opium and also Chinese immigrants in our area. And so now I know that, and I figure out, okay, so now I got to go back to my characters and like, what does this all mean to them? You know, what flaw does my character have that through the course of trying to solve a mystery involving opium and Chinese immigrants, you know, how is she going to grow as a person? And that's how I build that story. So I kind of figure those pieces out first, and then I go to my present, and then I'm asking sort of the same questions. So how could this be meaningful? What could be happening in the present? And often there's a mystery in the present too. Not always, but most often there's a probably every time there is actually. There's a mystery in the present too that is interconnected. So in this case, again, the mystery is going to involve, there's going to be like a Chinese Heritage Week celebration, and somebody's going to go missing, and it's all going to revolve around the fact that there's been an inquiry into that our heroine, our protagonist, she inherited her bookshop, and she inherited her great aunt's, like, all her belongings in the bookshop. And one of those things was a porcelain jar that, as it turns out, who knew? I just learned this researching this book, that like there are Chinese porcelain jars that have sold for millions of dollars recently. Like they're a huge thing. Well, there's a ball of opium in this jar, and the jar is worth a lot of money. But the expert tells her it's not worth a lot of money. So is it worth it, or is it not? And things just go from there. So the jar is there's often an artifact, to your question, like that spans the two and prompts the investigations. And then the person in the present, her name is Olivia, the bookshop owner, is looking into her own mystery. But to solve that mystery, she's using like newspaper articles that our heroine in the past wrote, and other things. In the seamstress secret, there's a wedding dress and a jewel connected with that dress, and so and articles that go with it. But I try to not always have the same sort of sources of information, so I'm kind of trying to build into the dual timelines, like, here's ways we all can investigate history, you know? Like sometimes it's the library. I'm going to work in, my husband and I often go to the TNT talks at Astoria on Thursday nights, third Thursdays, I think, the Historical Society. But this one was actually the first Thursday that college put on, and John Gutenberger, I think his name is, talked about the Pauper Cemetery. I don't know if anybody went to that, or I think he might be going to do it in Seaside too. Anyway, that was so fascinating. I'm like, oh, that totally fits with, because there was a Chinese section of the Pauper Cemetery, and I'm like, oh, that's going to get in my book for sure. Yeah. So anyway, does that answer your question enough? I think it's mostly the artifacts and the two mysteries, and just like, delving in.
And it's not sort of chapter by chapter. It doesn't flip back and forth, but within a chapter, both.
It does go chapter by chapter.
I see.
Yeah.
Okay.
And the first one that I did, I was really nervous about that. I'm like, oh my gosh. And I did some kind of, I can't remember what it was, elaborate system of trying to piece the parts together. But now it's pretty intuitive for me. Like I sit down, I write the past, I write the present, and then I just take a day and put them together, and they just go, because I'm kind of writing them that way, where I have it in mind. Oh, here's going to be a flipping point. You know, where you want to leave a little cliffhanger if you're going to leave a time period, you know, and then go to the next one, leave a cliffhanger, go to the next one, like that. So it's kind of laddering. But I do it chapter by chapter, and I always put the name of the protagonist. So it's either Josephine or Olivia, and the year, present day, or in this case, like the one that comes out this week, The Seamstress Secret, I think is 1890 is the year. So yeah. And readers tell me, that's another thing I noticed when I was looking at reader feedback. They're like, dual timeline, but not confusing, easy to follow. And I'm like, bingo, I'm glad, because that's what I was aiming for. So, yeah. Anything else?
What's next?
Oh, what's next? I'll answer this one and that one. Go ahead, though.
So when you're writing, have you put the bones of the story together before you start writing, or are you partially or maybe totally creating the story as you write it?
So you may have heard, if you've gone to a few of these talks, people talk about pantsers and plotters, right? And pantsers are writers who write by the seat of their pants, and plotters are writers who plot. When I worked with a writing center in Alaska, it was very literary oriented, and that's when I wrote my literary fiction, and I enjoyed that, but I didn't find the readers. And if you're going to spend a lot of time writing books, you want to have readers, right? And they just weren't. They don't get read as much. So it's more almost like a prestige type thing. It's art. I mean, it's good for its own sake. But for me, I wanted the readers. I wanted the interaction. So in the literary community, it's more, and this almost sounds backward if you're not a writer, like discovery writing, pantsing is the way you do it. Like you don't outline, because you're not letting like the muse and the free flow and all of this. And so I did that, and it's very hard for me. Just because I go way off in this direction, like, oh no, gotta go back. Well, that was 10 weeks lost, and then so now I have a way of thinking about my characters. And I get, like I said, I do my brainstorming, just free flowing, but then I do like it's kind of a series of 3 sort of ways to organize my ideas, and to make sure that I'm thinking about things like what's the theme of this book? Like, I don't think of that right away, but I want to know going into it before I start to write, after I kind of know the bones of it, like what's the theme? There's another term that I really like, which is universal fantasy. Like, we all have universal fantasies. What's the universal fantasy that readers, when they read this book and they finish it, they're going to say, yeah, that's, might doesn't always win, or whatever that universal fantasy is. I want to know that, and I want to satisfy that. So I just kind of have templates that remind me to think about those things, so that, and I rarely refer to them.
You can use those book to book.
I can use them book to book, and that helps me to do, the series, because when you do series, like, readers are like, I'm ready for the next one. Yeah. Almost so, writing quickly is important. But yeah, great question, and that's kind of how I do it. Every author does it differently. That being said, I'll go from kind of my one template, and I'll do an outline, and then I'll grab, when I'm sitting down to write for the day, I'll grab the next piece of the outline, which doesn't look like an outline like you learn in school. It's just like some words, but like, maybe these things will happen. I'll put it over here at the beginning of where I'm going to write. And then I'll just write. And sometimes it happens that way, and sometimes it happens differently, and then I just change the outline, and so that everything hangs together. So it's both, really. I'm discovering always as I'm going. I never say, oh no, I planned this 3 weeks ago, I got to stick with it, right? So, and then what's next? Thank you for asking. I'm gonna, when I finish the Tidewater Chronicles, that 5th book The Smuggler's Secret will probably come out in May. And then I already have kind of planned a series on Revolutionary War spies. I have Revolutionary War ancestors myself, and there were, again, women spies in the Revolutionary War. So I'm really excited about that one too. Yeah, so that'll be my next series. When
you research, do you travel back to the places where it happened? Like
Sometimes, but I've been to some of those places already, so that I'll draw on that. And I did find, I was a little nervous about that, because I'd written so many of the Alaska books and was so grounded in place. And when I did the Civil War ones, one of the a couple of the books have a lot of scenes in Nashville, and I've never been to Nashville. But you know what? Even if all of you have been to Nashville, you weren't there in 1863. So I feel like I have an advantage, right? It's almost more important to get the feeling of the setting right in the time period. Yeah, in a certain sense. So I think we're out of time. Is that correct? Or any further questions? I can talk all day, so we don't want that to happen. Yes.
You said you do your own publishing and you give us the advantages of it. There must be a few downsides. For instance, do you have access to an editor?
So I am a professional editor. So, but
it's hard to see one's own work.
So it's a very good question. So yes, there are advantages and disadvantages to both types of publishing. And actually, it's not really both anymore. I write for a publishing magazine, trade magazine as well, and traditional publishing trade magazine. But I just finished an article for them about publishing models, like different ways to publish. And people used to think, oh, you either publish yourself or you get a publisher. Well, this organization has identified 8 ways to publish. Wow. And I think that's really very representative of the space right now. But let's just, for ease of discussion, say there's the 2. There's still, definitely advantages and disadvantages. And it's very much about the writer and what they're looking for and their experience and their skill set, which is, I think, what you're getting at. And you do need a professional cover, you need a professional editor, and you need professional marketing. So which of those can you do yourself? Which of those can you afford to hire someone else to do? That's going to depend a lot on who you're writing for, which is going to depend, and that's going to determine how much you make, right? So for me, and you're right, it is hard to see your own flaws. However, I've gotten really good at it over the years. Like, I couldn't have said that even 10 years ago, but I've edited so much for so many other people that in fiction, I can generally see my flaws. That being said, I do have, I'm not a good proofreader anymore as I've gotten older. My mind corrects things. I just wrote, I hire a proofreader, but he got COVID for this last book. And he's like, I can't get it done. And he told me he couldn't get it done in time. So it's okay. I'll proofread it myself. And I know my mind just fixes errors. So I read it out loud. It takes me like 3 days. But if you read it out loud, that slows you down enough. But I still, when I'm reading it out loud, like I read this sentence about a pair of scones illuminating a room. I'm like, oh, well, see, there's my brain again. And then, so I went through all that and I caught a bunch of errors and fixed them. And then I have 4 volunteer proofreaders. So like readers that I don't know. Well, one of them is my daughter, but the other 3, I have never met. Like they are readers. They're avid readers of my work. They love my work. Like, and they've just randomly sent me, they were advanced readers because I use advanced readers to do reviews. But again, I don't know them. They like my work, and they'd read a book before it came out and say, oh, well, on page X or Y, you said pair of scones. And, and I'd say, do you want to proofread for me? Like I can, and a lot of times they'll just say, hey, if you ever want me to proofread for you, I'd be happy to, you don't have to pay me. So I send them a Starbucks card every book, but they, so I always send the book out to them and they go through and it's really interesting because they all find different stuff, except for this most recent book. I had a back account instead of a bank account. Now I even read that out loud and I read it the right way when I wrote it the wrong way, but that was one pretty much everyone caught, but not everybody. So just knowing what you can do, but the developmental part where you're looking at the story and like, does it work? Like that, I would say is my biggest strength as a writer. So I'm okay with that. Cover design, there's writers who can design a beautiful cover, not me. Like I depend heavily on, I have a cover designer in Great Britain and he does beautiful work, and that's where I get that done. Yeah.
I got here late, so are you from Alaska?
Yeah, I lived 36 years in Alaska, so most of my adult life. Yeah.
Where'd you live up there?
I lived in Nunapachuk, Tuluksek, Akiachuk, Bethel, Fairbanks, Anchorage, and Eagle River.
Did you say Actisop?
Akiachuk, not Akasuk. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. And you must know the state too.
Oh, yeah, I do. I was up there 30 years.
Oh, very cool. I always loved driving through Cannon Beach and seeing all the Alaska place names. So fun.
Yeah, lots of them here.
Yeah. No, it's like a lot.
That's quite a place.
What's that?
Bethel.
Oh, yes. Yeah, no, I taught at the community college there. Yeah, both my kids were born in Bethel.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I worked as a deckhand on the Yukon River on the barge.
Oh, nice.
Years
Nice.
ago.
Yeah. You probably got books you could write too.
I know.
Nice.
I wrote a book about my experiences as a deckhand on the Yukon River.
Awesome.
I wrote down what happened every day when I was working. So it's all true. It's what happened every day during one navigation season, 1981. And the Yukon River is a lot different then. There's no Yukon salmon anymore. There's no fish camps up and down the river, no fish reels. The natives don't have their fish camps. They don't visit like they used to. And we you could stop in at those fish camps, and everybody, they were always glad to see you. And so it's just changed a lot.
It's a way of life gone, really.
It is, yeah.
Yeah.
There's no navigational aids on the Yukon River. We just use a stump, and or a twisted tree and line that up with something else.
And I guarantee you that some author someday is going to find your book, because these are the best sources. I'm going to say writing historical fiction. And there was somebody that did a book like that. I couldn't tell you the name of it, but on the Columbia. And I used that because it's got so much detail, because you were right there and you were writing it every day.
When it happened.
And then I can go back and like, oh, here's what this part of the river looked like back then, because this person was right there and wrote it on that day. And it's so it's wonderful.
I've got it here. Can I just read the first sentence?
Sure.
And I'm not trying to promote myself. I changed all the names. There's mine. On Thursday night, I got drunk in the Wonder Bar and fell in the Chena River. It is springtime thaw in Fairbanks, snow and breakup, and after leaving the bar, I shared some whiskey in the willow brush across the street with a native girl and fell in the river when I slipped in the mud.
Oh boy.
That's the beginning. And I just gotten there, and I was going to have to fly out to St. Michael the next day to get on the barge down to Lower River at the mouth, and so I decided to drink.
Yeah, not the first guy that did that, I'm sure. We actually read a.
There was controversy. I had a headache.
That's for starters.
Very good, because the drunks are in the parking lot were fighting all night.
Goodness.
I say in the book they have a very limited vocabulary.
Well, most drunks, do have a limited vocabulary. I've been a bartender in my day. I'll vouch for that.
Anyway, I just thought I'd ask you. You've been to a lot of villages. Good.
Oh yes,
okay.
Lived in villages.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Good
I've been
experiences.
in a lot of villages.
So thank you all for coming, and there are books for sale. I do take credit cards, so yeah.
Thank you. Very, very much. Fascinating topic. Yes. And before we leave, I wanted to remind everyone that the writers read. There's a deadline coming up, February 2nd. February 2nd is when you have to have your entries in, and the theme this year is Beach Noir.
Oh, fun.
Beach what?
Beach Noir. Noir.
Black.
Yeah.